The morning sun cast long shadows across the cobblestones of Manchester's northern quarter as Detective Inspector Sarah Matthews reviewed the crime scene photographs one final time. 3 months had passed since the attack on Beth Shalom Synagogue, but the images still made her stomach clench with a familiar mixture of anger and determination. The shattered glass, the spray-painted hate symbols, the overturned prayer books scattered across the sanctuary floor. Each detail told a story of hatred that had shocked the entire community. Sarah closed the file and looked up at her partner, Detective Sergeant James Walsh, who was nursing his third cup of coffee of the morning. The Manchester Metropolitan Police had worked tirelessly to piece together the events of that terrible Friday evening in September, when 3 masked individuals had targeted the historic synagogue during evening prayers. What had started as vandalism had escalated into something far more serious when elderly congregation member David Goldstein had tried to intervene and suffered a severe head injury that left him hospitalized for weeks. The case had captured national attention, not just because of its brutality, but because of what it represented, a growing tide of anti-Semitic incidents across the United Kingdom that had alarmed community leaders and government officials alike. The Crown Prosecution Service had successfully convicted all 3 perpetrators, but the healing process for the community was far from complete. That was why today's visit was so significant. King Charles III had personally requested to meet with the victims and the broader Jewish community of Manchester. It was not just a ceremonial visit, but a genuine attempt to understand the impact of the attack and to demonstrate the monarchy's commitment to fighting all forms of religious hatred. The logistics had been complex, involving coordination between Buckingham Palace, Greater Manchester Police, the synagogue's leadership, and various community organizations. Rabbi Hannah Stern adjusted her prayer shawl as she walked through the now-repaired sanctuary of Beth Shalom Synagogue. The restoration had been completed just 2 weeks earlier, funded by donations that had poured in from across the country and around the world. The new stained glass windows sparkled in the morning light, more beautiful than the originals, but she knew that no amount of renovation could erase the memories of that night from the minds of those who had witnessed it. At 73, Rabbi Stern had served this community for nearly 4 decades. She had officiated at countless weddings, comforted families through times of loss, and guided her congregation through various challenges. But nothing had prepared her for the hatred that had erupted within these sacred walls 3 months ago. The attack had not just damaged property. It had shaken the very sense of security that her community had built over generations of making Manchester their home. The rabbi's phone buzzed with another text from the palace protocol officer, confirming the afternoon schedule. His Majesty would arrive at 2 o'clock precisely, spend 30 minutes touring the restored synagogue, then participate in a private meeting with 12 individuals who had been directly affected by the attack. The selection of those 12 people had been one of the most difficult tasks Rabbi Stern had ever undertaken. David Goldstein, the 78-year-old retired teacher who had been injured while trying to protect the Torah scrolls, was an obvious choice. Miriam Cohen, a prominent psychiatrist who specialized in trauma counseling, had volunteered her services to help community members process their experiences. At 55, she brought both professional expertise and personal understanding to her work, having grown up hearing her grandmother's stories about fleeing persecution in Eastern Europe. Her insights into the psychological aftermath of the attack had been invaluable in helping the community begin to heal. The youngest person selected for the meeting was 16-year-old Aaron Levy, a student at Manchester Grammar School who had been preparing for his bar mitzvah when the attack occurred. His parents had briefly considered postponing the ceremony, but Aaron had insisted on moving forward as planned. His determination to celebrate his coming of age despite the trauma had inspired many in the community and demonstrated a resilience that Rabbi Stern found both heartbreaking and hopeful. Among the adults was 42-year-old businessman Simon Hartwell, who owned a successful tech company and had been one of the synagogue's most generous benefactors. The attack had prompted him to question not just his personal security, but his responsibility as a prominent Jewish figure in Manchester's business community. His struggle with the decision of whether to maintain a lower profile or to speak out more forcefully against anti-Semitism reflected a dilemma faced by many successful Jewish professionals. Mrs. Esther Roth, at 86, was the synagogue's oldest regular attendee and had witnessed the entire attack from her usual seat in the front row. A Holocaust survivor who had arrived in Britain as a young woman after the war, she possessed a perspective that spanned decades of both progress and setbacks in the fight against religious hatred. Her presence at the meeting would provide historical context that younger community members might lack. The final selections included cantor Benjamin Ashford, whose melodious voice had filled the sanctuary for 15 years until that terrible night when his singing had been interrupted by shattering glass. He had struggled with anxiety about returning to lead services, though his love for music and tradition had ultimately overcome his fears. His journey back to confidence represented the broader challenge facing the entire congregation. As the morning progressed, security preparations intensified around the synagogue. Armed police officers took positions at strategic points while plainclothes detectives mingled with a growing crowd of onlookers. The King's Protection Team had conducted multiple sweeps of the building and surrounding area, working closely with local authorities to ensure that the visit would proceed without incident. The media presence was substantial but carefully managed. Representatives from major news organizations had been granted limited access, with pool reporters selected to provide coverage for their colleagues. The palace had made it clear that this was not intended as a photo opportunity, but rather as a meaningful engagement with a community that had suffered a serious attack. Community leaders from other faiths had also requested to participate in the day's events. The Archbishop of Manchester, several prominent Muslim leaders, and representatives from various Christian denominations wanted to show solidarity with their Jewish neighbors. Their presence would underscore the broader message that attacks on one faith community represented attacks on the fundamental principle of religious freedom that underpinned British society. The logistics of managing such a high-profile visit in the wake of a hate crime required careful coordination between multiple agencies. Counterterrorism specialists had reviewed every aspect of the planned itinerary, while community liaison officers had worked to address concerns from local residents about traffic disruptions and security measures. The goal was to balance the need for thorough protection with the desire to maintain the accessibility and openness that characterized the king's interactions with his subjects. Young Aaron Levy stood before his bedroom mirror, adjusting his tie for the third time. His mother had helped him select his best suit, the same one he had worn for his bar mitzvah just 6 weeks earlier. The ceremony had taken place in the newly restored synagogue, surrounded by family, friends, and community members who had refused to let hatred diminish their celebration of Jewish tradition and continuity. Aaron's preparation for this meeting with the king had been different from his bar mitzvah preparation. While that had involved months of studying Hebrew texts and learning ancient melodies, preparing to meet His Majesty had required him to think deeply about his experiences and their broader significance. His parents had gently encouraged him to consider what message he wanted to convey about young people's resilience and their commitment to maintaining their faith despite facing hatred. The teenager had drafted several different versions of what he might say if given the opportunity to speak. Some focused on the fear he had felt that night and in the weeks that followed. Others emphasized his determination not to let the attackers achieve their goal of making Jewish people feel unwelcome in Manchester. The version he had settled on attempted to balance both emotions while expressing gratitude for the support the community had received from people of all backgrounds. Across the city, David Goldstein was also preparing for the meeting, though his routine was complicated by the ongoing effects of his injury. His wife, Ruth, had laid out his clothes and prepared his medication while he slowly worked through his morning exercises, designed to help with balance and coordination. The physical therapy had been frustrating for a man who had prided himself on his independence and vitality, but he had approached his recovery with the same methodical determination that had made him a beloved mathematics teacher for 4 decades. David's memories of the attack remained fragmented, which sometimes frustrated him, but perhaps also served as a protective mechanism. He could recall the sound of breaking glass and his instinctive move toward the ark containing the Torah scrolls. But the actual moment of impact remained mercifully blank. What he remembered with crystal clarity was waking up in the hospital 3 days later to find his room filled with flowers, cards, and visitors from not just the Jewish community, but from across Manchester's diverse population. The outpouring of support had surprised and moved him. Former students, now adults with children of their own, had traveled from across the country to visit. His old teaching colleagues had organized fundraisers for his medical expenses, though his care was covered by the NHS. Most memorably, a group of young Muslim men from the nearby mosque had appointed themselves as informal guardians of his house during his hospitalization, making sure his garden was tended and his mail was collected. Dr. Miriam Cohen had spent the early morning reviewing her notes from counseling sessions with various community members. As someone trained to help people process trauma, she understood that today's meeting represented both an opportunity and a potential challenge. For some, the formal recognition of their experience by the head of state would provide validation and a sense of closure. For others, the attention and ceremony might reawaken difficult emotions that they were still learning to manage. Her own participation in the meeting reflected her dual role as both a professional counselor and a community member who had been personally affected by the attack. While she had not been present that night, the incident had forced her to confront her own assumptions about safety and belonging in modern Britain. Her parents had immigrated from Hungary in the 1950s, seeking the stability and tolerance that Britain promised. The synagogue attack had challenged her faith in that promise, even as the subsequent community response had ultimately reinforced it. The psychological impact of hate crimes extended far beyond their immediate victims, and Dr. Cohen had observed this phenomenon clearly in the weeks following the attack. Children who had never experienced anti-Semitism directly suddenly, worried about wearing their school uniforms that identified them as students at Jewish schools. Parents found themselves having conversations with young children about hatred and prejudice that they had hoped to delay for many years. Elderly community members were transported back to earlier periods in their lives when being Jewish had meant living with constant awareness of potential danger. Yet alongside these understandable fears, Dr. Cohen had also witnessed remarkable examples of resilience and growth. Community members had deepened their connections with each other and with neighbors from different backgrounds. Young people had become more articulate about their identity and more determined to maintain their traditions. The attack had been intended to weaken and intimidate, but in many ways it had strengthened resolve and clarified values. As the appointed time for the king's arrival approached, the selected community members began gathering in the synagogue's newly renovated community hall. The room buzzed with nervous energy and quiet conversations as people who had shared a traumatic experience prepare to share their stories with someone whose life and responsibilities were almost impossible for them to imagine. Rabbi Stern moved among the group, offering reassurance and reminding them that this meeting was their opportunity to help the king understand not just what had happened to them, but how their community had responded with dignity and determination. The attack had been an attempt to erase their presence and silence their voices. Today, they would speak for themselves and for all those who had supported them in their journey toward healing. The transformation of their pain into purpose would soon be put to the test, as the most recognizable figure in Britain prepared to listen to their experiences and learn from their example. The meeting would mark not an ending, but a new chapter in their ongoing effort to build a society where hatred could not flourish and where all citizens could practice their faith without fear. The black Bentley bearing the royal standard turned on a Cheetham Hill road at exactly 2 o'clock, flanked by police motorcycles and followed by a convoy of support vehicles. Inside the synagogue, Rabbi Stern felt her heart rate quicken as she watched through the window. After months of planning and preparation, the moment had finally arrived. The weight of representing her community's experience to the king felt both humbling and overwhelming. King Charles III emerged from the vehicle with the practiced ease of someone who had attended thousands of official engagements. At 75, he moved with the measured dignity that had characterized his public appearances since ascending to the throne. His dark blue suit was perfectly tailored, and his expression conveyed both the gravity of the occasion and a genuine warmth that immediately put the small group of waiting community leaders at ease. The king's first stop was a private tour of the synagogue itself, accompanied only by Rabbi Stern, 2 security officers, and the chief constable of Greater Manchester Police. As they entered the sanctuary, His Majesty paused to take in the restored space. The afternoon light streamed through the new stained glass windows, casting colorful patterns across the polished wooden pews and the ornate ark that housed the Torah scrolls. "The craftsmanship is extraordinary," the king observed, his voice carrying the appreciation of someone who understood both artistic excellence and historical preservation. "How long did the restoration take?" Rabbi Stern explained that the work had been completed in just 8 weeks, thanks to an unprecedented collaboration between local artisans, international donors, and volunteers from across Manchester's diverse communities. The speed of the restoration had been important for the congregation's emotional healing, allowing them to reclaim their sacred space without an extended period of displacement. The king listened intently as she described the damage that had been inflicted. The original 19th century windows had been irreplaceable, but the new ones incorporated elements of the traditional designs while adding symbols representing hope and renewal. The floor had been completely refinished after bloodstains, and graffiti had made the original surface impossible to restore. Even the wooden pews had been replaced, though the synagogue had kept several pieces of the damaged furniture as reminders of both the attack and the community's determination to rebuild. "Were you here that night?" the king asked gently. "I was at home preparing my sermon," Rabbi Stern replied. "I received the first phone call at 9:37. By the time I arrived, the ambulances were already here." The king nodded thoughtfully, understanding that the trauma of arriving to find one's sacred space violated might be different from, but no less significant than witnessing the attack itself. His questions demonstrated a deeper understanding of religious community dynamics than many might have expected from someone whose own faith tradition was quite different. As they moved toward the ark, Rabbi Stern explained the significance of the Torah scrolls that David Goldstein had tried to protect. These handwritten texts, some dating back over a century, represented the physical embodiment of Jewish law and history. The fact that an elderly man had risked his safety to shield them from harm spoke to the deep spiritual connection that bound this community together. "May I?" the king asked, gesturing toward the ark. Rabbi Stern opened the ornate wooden doors to reveal 3 Torah scrolls, each covered in elaborately embroidered cloth. The king observed them with respectful silence, understanding that he was viewing objects of profound religious significance. His knowledge of Jewish traditions, gained through decades of interfaith dialogue, allowed him to appreciate not just their beauty, but their meaning. "The one in the center survived the attack," Rabbi Stern explained. "When we examined it afterward, we found that not a single letter had been damaged." The congregation saw this as a sign that our traditions would endure. After completing the synagogue tour, the king was escorted to the community hall where the 12 selected community members waited. The room fell silent as he entered, and several people stood nervously. His first words immediately set a different tone than many had expected. "Please, everyone remain seated and comfortable," he said with a warm smile. "This is your space, and I am here as your guest to listen and learn." Rabbi Stern made brief introductions, and the king moved around the room to shake hands with each person individually. He spent a moment with each one, making eye contact and asking a personal question that demonstrated he had taken time to learn about their individual experiences. When he reached David Goldstein, the king paused longer. "Mr. Goldstein, I understand your recovery has been remarkable. How are you feeling today?" David, who had been nervous about potentially becoming confused during the conversation, found himself surprisingly calm in the king's presence. "Your Majesty, I feel grateful," he said simply. Grateful to be here, grateful for the care I received, and grateful for this community. The king spent several minutes talking with David about his career and education, drawing connections to his own experiences visiting schools across the Commonwealth. David's granddaughter Rebecca watched with amazement as her grandfather, who had struggled with confidence since his injury, engaged in fluent conversation about teaching methods and student engagement. Young Aaron Levy had prepared extensively for this moment, but found himself unexpectedly tongue-tied when the king approached. "I understand you recently celebrated your bar mitzvah," His Majesty said. "That must have been a very meaningful ceremony, given everything that had happened." Aaron nodded, then found his voice. "Yes, sir. Your Majesty. It felt important to show that we wouldn't let anyone stop us from celebrating who we are." "That demonstrates remarkable courage for someone your age," the king replied. "What advice would you give to other young people who might face similar challenges?" The question was exactly what Aaron had hoped for. "I would tell them that our traditions have survived much worse than this," he said, his confidence growing. "Every generation has people who try to scare us, but every generation also has people who protect us. We have to decide which kind of person we want to be." The king smiled broadly at this response, clearly impressed by the teenager's thoughtfulness. Wise words from someone who clearly understands both history and hope. Dr. Miriam Cohen had been observing the king's interactions with her trained eye, noting his ability to adapt his communication style to each person's age and emotional state. When he approached her, she was prepared to discuss the psychological impact of hate crimes from a clinical perspective. "Dr. Cohen, you've been helping community members process their experiences," the king began. "What have you learned about resilience and recovery?" "Your Majesty, what has struck me most is how trauma can sometimes reveal strengths that people didn't know they possessed," she replied. "Many of our community members have discovered that they are braver and more determined than they previously believed. The challenge is helping them integrate these discoveries into their ongoing lives." The king asked thoughtful follow-up questions about the broader impact of hate crimes on communities and the role that official recognition and support could play in healing. Dr. Cohen found herself engaged in the kind of substantive policy discussion that she had hoped might emerge from the meeting. The Rosen family presented a unique dynamic, with 8-year-old twins Joshua and Samuel fidgeting nervously beside their parents. The king immediately knelt down to their eye level, understanding that the formal setting might be intimidating for young children. "Boys, I hear you were very brave that night," he said gently. "What do you like best about your new synagogue?" Joshua, the more outgoing of the twins, pointed to the colorful windows. "They're prettier than before," he said matter-of-factly, "and they make rainbow patterns on the floor." Samuel, usually more reserved, surprised everyone by asking, "Do you have a crown?" The king laughed warmly. "I do have several crowns, but I only wear them for very special occasions. Today, I wanted to dress normally so we could have a regular conversation." Their parents, Michael and Elena, watched this interaction with visible relief. They had worried about how their children would react to such a formal setting, but the king's natural ease with young people was helping them feel comfortable. Mrs. Esther Roth, as the eldest member of the group, commanded particular attention. At 86, she carried the authority of someone who had witnessed both the worst and best of human nature. The king approached her with a special respect due to her age and experience. "Mrs. Roth, Rabbi Stern tells me you have an extraordinary perspective on these events," he said, taking the chair beside her that had been left empty for this purpose. "Your Majesty, I have seen hatred before," she replied in her still strong voice, tinged with the accent of her Austrian childhood. "What I have also seen is that hatred never wins in the long run. It makes noise, it causes pain, but it does not build anything lasting." The king listened intently as she described her experiences as a young refugee arriving in Britain after the Second World War. Her story of rebuilding her life, learning English, and eventually becoming a pillar of the Manchester Jewish community provided powerful context for understanding both the vulnerability and the resilience of minority populations. "When those men came into our synagogue," she continued, "I was not afraid for myself. I was angry that they thought they could make us disappear. But look around this room, Your Majesty. We are still here. We are still strong. And we have new friends who stand with us. The formal part of the meeting transitioned into a more free-flowing conversation as community members began to share their experiences and ask questions. The king demonstrated remarkable knowledge about the history of Jewish communities in Britain and showed particular interest in interfaith cooperation efforts that had emerged in response to the attack. Simon Hartwell, the businessman who had struggled with questions about maintaining a public profile, found himself discussing the responsibilities that came with success and visibility. The king, who understood something about living with public scrutiny, offered thoughtful perspectives on balancing personal security with civic engagement. The challenge, His Majesty observed, is not to let reasonable precautions become a retreat from public life. Communities need visible leaders who are willing to stand up for their values. Cantor Ashford had been quiet for much of the meeting, but when the conversation turned to the role of music and tradition in healing, he found his voice. He described the difficulty he had experienced returning to lead services and the gradual process of rebuilding his confidence. Music has always been my way of connecting with the divine, he explained. When that connection was disrupted by violence, I felt lost. But the community support helped me remember that my voice belongs to all of us, not just to me. The king asked if he might be willing to sing something, if he felt comfortable doing so. After a moment's hesitation, Cantor Ashford began a traditional Hebrew melody, his rich baritone filling the community hall. The simple, ancient tune seemed to transform the atmosphere in the room, reminding everyone of the spiritual foundations that had sustained their community through this difficult period. As the formal meeting drew to a close, the king addressed the group collectively. You have shared your pain with me today, but more importantly, you have shared your strength, he said. Your experiences will help me better understand the challenges facing all of Britain's faith communities, and your example will inspire others who may face similar tests. He spoke about the broader context of rising hate crimes across Europe and the importance of communities coming together to reject extremism in all its forms. His words carried the weight of his constitutional role, but also the personal conviction of someone who genuinely believed in the values of tolerance and mutual respect. The meeting concluded with individual photographs and a group picture that would later be displayed prominently in the synagogue's entrance hall. As the king prepared to depart, several community members expressed their gratitude for his willingness to spend time listening to their stories rather than simply making a ceremonial appearance. Outside, media representatives were waiting for a brief statement. The king's words were carefully chosen to acknowledge both the seriousness of the attack and the inspiring response of the community and the broader Manchester population. He spoke about the importance of religious freedom and the responsibility of all citizens to stand against hatred in whatever form it might take. The royal visit lasted just over 2 hours, but its impact would resonate far beyond that afternoon. For the Jewish community of Manchester, it represented official recognition of their experience and validation of their place in British society. For the broader population watching the coverage, it demonstrated the kind of leadership and moral clarity that many had hoped to see in response to rising intolerance. As the royal convoy departed, the 12 community members remained in the hall, processing what had just occurred. The conversation continued for another hour as they shared their impressions and reflected on the significance of having their voices heard at the highest levels of government and society. The healing process that had begun in the immediate aftermath of the attack had reached an important milestone. Though everyone understood that the work of building a truly inclusive society would continue long after the cameras had departed and the security barriers had been removed. The aftermath of the royal visit brought an unexpected energy to Manchester's Jewish community that extended far beyond the synagogue walls. In the days following the king's departure, Rabbi Stern found herself fielding phone calls from Jewish communities across Britain who wanted to learn about their experience and discuss their own security concerns. The meeting had elevated their local tragedy into a national conversation about religious tolerance and community resilience. Detective Inspector Sarah Matthews had watched the royal visit from a respectful distance, coordinating security operations while observing the interactions between the king and the community members she had come to know well during her investigation. The successful prosecution of the attackers had provided legal closure, but she recognized that emotional healing followed a different timeline. Seeing the dignity and strength displayed by the victims during their meeting with His Majesty reinforced her belief that justice extended beyond courtroom verdicts. The three convicted attackers were serving sentences ranging from 4 to 8 years, depending on their level of involvement and prior criminal history. The investigation had revealed that their attack was not part of any organized conspiracy, but rather the result of online radicalization and personal grievances that had crystallized into religious hatred. Sarah had testified during the sentencing phase about the broader impact of their actions, helping the judge understand that hate crimes ripple through entire communities in ways that simple assault or vandalism cases do not. Young Aaron Levy returned to Manchester Grammar School the Monday after the royal visit with a new confidence that surprised both his teachers and classmates. Word of his conversation with the king had spread quickly through the school, and he found himself fielding questions about the experience from students who had previously shown little interest in his Jewish identity. The attention was sometimes overwhelming, but it also provided opportunities to educate his peers about anti-Semitism and religious diversity. Aaron's history teacher, Mr. Thompson, had asked him to speak to several classes about his experience, both as a witness to a hate crime and as someone who had met the king. These presentations helped Aaron articulate his thoughts about identity, resilience, and civic responsibility in ways that his bar mitzvah training had begun but not completed. He discovered that he enjoyed public speaking and began to consider whether advocacy work might play a role in his future career plans. The teenager's newfound visibility also brought challenges. Some classmates questioned why he received special attention for being a victim, while others made thoughtless comments about Jewish people that revealed their ignorance rather than malice. Aaron learned to navigate these situations with patience and education, understanding that changing minds was often a gradual process that required persistence rather than confrontation. David Goldstein's recovery had accelerated noticeably after the royal visit. His neurologist, Dr. Patricia Williams, noted improvements in both his cognitive function and his emotional state during his follow-up appointment. The validation of having his experience acknowledged by the king seemed to have provided psychological benefits that complemented his ongoing medical treatment. Meeting His Majesty reminded me that what happened to me mattered to people I'll never meet, David explained to Dr. Williams. It helped me stop feeling like I was just an old man who got in the way of some vandals. David had begun volunteering at a local interfaith center, sharing his story with groups from different religious backgrounds. His role as an educator had prepared him well for this new responsibility, and he found that talking about his experience helped him process emotions that he had struggled to express to his family. The volunteer work also provided structure and purpose during his ongoing recovery. His granddaughter Rebecca had been deeply moved by witnessing her grandfather's interaction with the king. As a medical student, she understood the clinical aspects of his recovery, but seeing his dignity and eloquence during the royal meeting had reminded her of the psychological dimensions of healing. She had begun considering specialization in trauma medicine, inspired partly by her grandfather's experience and the care he had received. Rebecca had also become involved in organizing security awareness training for Jewish community groups across Greater Manchester. Her medical training provided useful perspective on emergency response procedures, while her personal experience as a family member of a victim helped her understand the emotional needs of people facing similar threats. The Rosen family had used the royal visit as an opportunity to reflect on their decision to make Manchester their permanent home. The weeks following the attack had been filled with doubts about their choice, particularly Elena's concerns about raising the twins in a community that had experienced such violence. However, the outpouring of support from neighbors, the effective police response, and ultimately the king's personal attention had reinforced their sense of belonging. Michael Rosen had been particularly impressed by the interfaith relationships that had emerged in response to the attack. His work in information technology had given him experience with diverse teams, but he had not previously understood how religious communities could support each other during times of crisis. The mosque members who had helped guard David Goldstein's home, the Christian volunteers who had assisted with the synagogue restoration, and the Sikh community leaders who had organized a solidarity rally had all demonstrated a model of citizenship that he wanted his sons to understand and emulate. The twins, Joshua and Samuel, had adapted to their newfound status as children who had met the king with typical 8-year-old enthusiasm. Their classmates at the Jewish primary school were endlessly curious about the experience, leading to playground conversations about monarchy, government, and religious freedom that would have challenged many adults. Their teacher, Mrs. Goldman, had incorporated their experience into social studies lessons that helped all the children better understand their rights and responsibilities as British citizens. Dr. Miriam Cohen had been invited to present her findings about community trauma recovery at a conference organized by the Home Office. Her analysis of the Manchester Synagogue attack's psychological impact had broader implications for how authorities should respond to hate crimes and support affected communities. The royal visit had provided valuable data about the role that official recognition could play in healing processes. Her research had identified several factors that had contributed to the community's resilience. The rapid police response and successful prosecution had provided a sense of justice and security. The immediate support from diverse religious and civic groups had prevented the isolation that often compounds trauma. The community's own strong internal networks had enabled mutual support and collective decision-making about recovery priorities. Most significantly, the opportunity for community members to tell their stories in meaningful settings had helped transform their status from victims to advocates. The royal visit represented the culmination of this process, providing a platform that elevated their local experience in a national discourse about religious tolerance and community solidarity. Mrs. Esther Roth had become something of a celebrity in Manchester's Jewish community following her conversation with the king. Her combination of historical perspective and contemporary wisdom had resonated with people who were struggling to understand current events in the context of longer patterns of persecution and survival. She had begun speaking regularly at community events, sharing stories about her immigration experience, and drawing connections to current challenges. Her presence at these gatherings provided continuity between generations that had experienced different forms of anti-Semitism and discrimination. Young adults who had grown up feeling secure in British society found her stories both sobering and inspiring. Elderly community members who remembered earlier periods of tension found comfort in her perspective that current challenges, while serious, were manageable with proper community response and official support. Mrs. Roth had also developed an unexpected friendship with several Muslim women from the nearby Islamic Center who had reached out after the royal visit. Their conversations about maintaining religious identity in secular society and dealing with prejudice had revealed common experiences that transcended their different faith traditions. Simon Hartwell had decided to increase rather than decrease his public profile following the royal visit. His conversation with the king about balancing personal security with civic responsibility had clarified his thinking about the obligations that came with success and visibility. He had begun speaking publicly about anti-Semitism in business settings and had established a scholarship fund to support interfaith dialogue programs at Manchester universities. His technology company had also launched a partnership with local schools to provide computer literacy training in diverse communities, including areas where anti-Semitic attitudes might be more prevalent. Simon believed that education and economic opportunity were among the most effective long-term strategies for combating all forms of prejudice and extremism. The scholarship fund had attracted donations from across Manchester's business community, including substantial contributions from leaders of other faith traditions who wanted to demonstrate solidarity. The first recipients would be selected based on their commitment to promoting interfaith understanding, regardless of their specific religious background. Cantor Ashford had experienced a remarkable transformation following his performance during the royal visit. The simple act of singing in the king's presence had reminded him of music's power to transcend fear and division. He had begun collaborating with musicians from other religious traditions on interfaith concerts that celebrated Manchester's diversity while acknowledging the challenges posed by hatred and extremism. His first major collaboration was with the choir director for Manchester Cathedral and the musical director of the Central Mosque. Together, they were preparing a concert featuring music from Jewish, Christian, and Islamic traditions that would be performed in venues representing all three faiths. The project had generated considerable media attention and advanced ticket sales, suggesting strong community interest in positive interfaith engagement. Cantor Ashford had also begun working with Manchester's music therapy programs, using his skills to help trauma survivors from various backgrounds process their experiences through song and rhythm. This work had expanded his understanding of music's therapeutic potential and had connected him with healthcare professionals who were developing innovative treatment approaches. The broader Manchester Jewish community had experienced changes that extended well beyond the synagogue directly affected by the attack. Other Jewish institutions had upgraded their security measures and reviewed their emergency response procedures, but they had also strengthened their connections with each other and with non-Jewish organizations committed to religious freedom. The Board of Deputies of British Jews had used the Manchester attack as a case study for developing improved hate crime response protocols. Their recommendations emphasized the importance of immediate community support, effective police liaison, and strategic media engagement to prevent individual incidents from escalating into broader tensions or copycat attacks. Local government officials had also drawn lessons from the Manchester response that were being applied in other contexts. The speed and effectiveness of the multi-agency cooperation had demonstrated best practices for handling hate crimes that required both law enforcement and community healing approaches. Detective Inspector Sarah Matthews had been promoted to Chief Inspector partly in recognition of her work on the synagogue attack investigation. Her new responsibilities included overseeing hate crime investigations across Greater Manchester and developing training programs for officers who would handle similar cases. The royal visit had validated the thoroughness of her original investigation and had demonstrated the importance of understanding cultural and religious contexts when dealing with crimes targeting specific communities. Sarah had begun working with academic researchers studying the effectiveness of different approaches to hate crime investigation and prosecution. Her case files from the synagogue attack had become part of a larger database being used to identify patterns and develop improved response strategies. The three convicted attackers had been placed in different prisons to prevent them from reinforcing each other's extremist views. Prison officials were implementing rehabilitation programs designed specifically for individuals convicted of religiously motivated crimes, though the effectiveness of these interventions remained to be proven. Two of the three had expressed remorse for their actions, though their sincerity remained questionable. The third continued to maintain that his actions were justified, despite overwhelming evidence of the harm he had caused. Prison psychologists were working with all three to address the underlying attitudes and beliefs that had led to their criminal behavior. As autumn turned to winter, the Jewish community of Manchester prepared for their first major holiday season since the attack. Rosh Hashanah and Yom Kippur would test their emotional recovery and their confidence in their security measures. The royal visit had provided a powerful boost to their morale, but the real measure of their resilience would come through their ability to maintain their traditions and their sense of community safety during these important religious observances. The planning for these holidays involved not just internal preparation, but coordination with police and interfaith partners who had demonstrated their commitment to supporting Jewish religious freedom. The response to the royal visit had shown that Manchester's diverse communities were willing to stand together against hatred, but that commitment would need to be sustained through ongoing cooperation and mutual support. The conversation that had begun with tragedy was evolving into a broader dialogue about building inclusive communities that could resist extremism while celebrating diversity. The king's visit had marked an important milestone in that conversation, but The real work of creating lasting change would require sustained effort from ordinary citizens committed to the values of tolerance and mutual respect. 6 months after the royal visit, Manchester's Jewish community gathered for their annual Holocaust Memorial Day observance, with a sense of purpose that had been strengthened by their recent experiences. The event, held at the city's Civic Center, drew the largest attendance in its 15-year history. Representatives from across Greater Manchester's diverse population filled the auditorium, demonstrating that the lessons learned from the synagogue attack had resonated far beyond the directly affected community. Rabbi Stern stood at the podium, looking out at faces that represented the full spectrum of Manchester's religious and ethnic diversity. The invitation list had expanded significantly since the royal visit, with community leaders recognizing that commemorating historical tragedies required broad coalitions capable of preventing contemporary repetitions. Her remarks would connect the systematic persecution of the past with the individual acts of hatred that continued to threaten democratic societies. 6 months ago, we experienced a small taste of the hatred that once consumed Europe, she began. Today, we stand together not just to remember those who perished, but to honor those who survived, those who resisted, and those who continue to choose hope over fear. In the audience, Mrs. Esther Roth nodded approvingly. At 86, she had become the unofficial bridge between historical memory and contemporary challenges. Her weekly talks at local schools had reached hundreds of young people who might otherwise have had no direct connection to Holocaust history. These presentations always concluded with discussions about current events, helping students understand how historical lessons applied to modern situations. The memorial service included readings from survivors of various genocides, not just the Holocaust. This broader scope reflected the community's understanding that fighting anti-Semitism required solidarity with all groups targeted by systematic hatred. A young Bosnian refugee read a poem about displacement and recovery. A Rwandan survivor spoke about the importance of witness testimony. An elderly Sikh gentleman described his family's experience during the partition of India. David Goldstein participated in the memorial service by lighting one of the 6 candles representing the millions of Jewish victims. His recovery had progressed to the point where he could walk unassisted, though he still tired easily during long events. The symbolism of his participation was not lost on the audience. Here was a man who had been targeted by hatred, but had refused to be silenced or intimidated. His granddaughter Rebecca, now in her final year of medical school, had chosen emergency medicine as her specialty. Her experiences following the synagogue attack had convinced her that trauma care required not just clinical skills, but cultural competency and community awareness. She planned to complete her residency at Manchester's Trauma Center, where she hoped to improve care protocols for hate crime victims. Rebecca had also become involved in training emergency responders about the specific needs of different religious communities. Her presentations covered practical issues like dietary restrictions and modesty requirements, but also addressed the psychological dimensions of caring for people whose trauma resulted from identity-based attacks. Young Aaron Levy, now 17 and preparing for university applications, had decided to study law with the goal of specializing in civil rights and hate crime prosecution. His conversations with the king had sparked an interest in how legal systems could be used to protect minority communities while preserving democratic freedoms. He had begun volunteering with civil liberties organizations and had testified before a parliamentary committee studying hate crime legislation. Aaron's transformation from victim to advocate had been gradual but profound. His bar mitzvah speech had focused on personal resilience. His remarks at the Holocaust Memorial Day service addressed systemic change and collective responsibility. The evolution reflected not just his emotional recovery, but his growing understanding of citizenship and social justice. His parents watched with pride and some concern as their son took on increasingly public roles. The attention had brought opportunities for leadership development and civic engagement, but it had also exposed him to criticism and further targeting by extremist groups. They had hired a security consultant to assess potential threats and had modified some family routines to reduce risk. The Rosen family had fully embraced Manchester as their permanent home, with Michael and Elena both taking on volunteer leadership roles in interfaith organizations. Their twins, now 9 years old, attended a diverse primary school where their experience during the synagogue attack had become part of classroom discussions about tolerance and community support. The boys had difficulty understanding why anyone would want to hurt people because of their religion, which their parents considered both innocent and inspiring. Elena Rosen had started a support group for families who had experienced hate crimes, recognizing that children and spouses of direct victims often received insufficient attention and resources. The group met monthly and had expanded to include families affected by various forms of prejudice-motivated violence. The sessions provided practical advice about security measures and emotional support for processing ongoing fears. Dr. Miriam Cohen had completed her research on community trauma recovery and was preparing to publish her findings in several academic journals. Her analysis of the Manchester Synagogue attack had identified specific factors that contributed to successful healing: rapid law enforcement response, immediate community solidarity, sustained interfaith support, meaningful opportunities for victims to share their stories, and official recognition from respected authorities. The royal visit had represented the culmination of this healing process, but Dr. Cohen's research had also identified ongoing needs that required long-term attention. Some community members continued to experience anxiety during religious services or when visiting Jewish institutions. Others had difficulty trusting that interfaith relationships would remain strong if tested by future incidents. A few had developed hypervigilance about security that interfered with their daily functioning. Her treatment approaches had evolved to address both individual trauma and collective healing. Group therapy sessions allowed community members to process shared experiences, while individual counseling addressed specific psychological symptoms. Family therapy helped relatives understand how trauma affected different age groups and relationship dynamics. Simon Hartwell had expanded his philanthropic activities to include a new foundation focused on combating online radicalization. His research into the backgrounds of the synagogue attackers had revealed the role that internet extremism had played in their radicalization process. The foundation funded research into early detection of radicalization and intervention programs designed to redirect young people away from extremist ideologies. The foundation's work had attracted international attention, with researchers from across Europe and North America collaborating on projects that addressed the global nature of online hate. Simon's business background had helped him understand the technical aspects of how extremist content spread through social media platforms and how artificial intelligence might be used to detect and counter dangerous messaging. His increased public profile had brought both opportunities and risks. He had received threats from extremist groups, but had also been invited to advise government agencies and international organizations about private sector approaches to combating hatred. His security team had been expanded, but he refused to reduce his community engagement activities. Cantor Ashford's interfaith music collaborations had grown into a permanent Manchester interfaith choir that performed regularly throughout the region. The group included singers from Jewish, Christian, Muslim, Hindu, Sikh, and Buddhist communities, with repertoire drawn from all traditions. Their concerts had become major community events that celebrated diversity while acknowledging shared human experiences of joy, sorrow, and hope. The choir's success had inspired similar groups in other cities, creating a network of interfaith musicians who shared arrangements and performance techniques. Cantor Ashford had been invited to lead workshops across Britain and had begun developing a curriculum for music-based interfaith education that could be used in schools and religious institutions. His personal recovery from the trauma of the attack had been aided significantly by the creative outlet that the interfaith were provided. Music had always been his primary means of spiritual expression, but collaborating with artists from other traditions had expanded his understanding of how sound and rhythm could bridge cultural divides. Detective Chief Inspector Sarah Matthews had implemented new training protocols for hate crime investigations based on lessons learned from the synagogue attack case. All officers assigned to hate crime units now received specialized education about different religious and ethnic communities, with emphasis on understanding how identity-based attacks affected both individuals and groups. Sarah had also developed improved coordination procedures between police and community organizations, recognizing that effective law enforcement required trust and cooperation from the populations being served. Regular liaison meetings, community advisory boards, and cultural competency training had become standard elements of hate crime response in Greater Manchester. Her work had attracted attention from law enforcement agencies across Europe, where hate crime rates were rising in multiple countries. She had testified before parliamentary committees, spoken at international conferences, and consulted on policy development for organizations combating religious and ethnic hatred. The three convicted attackers had experienced different trajectories during their imprisonment. One had participated actively in rehabilitation programming and had expressed genuine remorse for his actions. He had requested meetings with community representatives to apologize directly and to understand the impact of his crimes. Prison officials considered him a candidate for early release with extensive supervision and community service requirements. The second attacker had been more resistant to rehabilitation efforts, but had gradually begun to engage with prison education programs. His participation appeared motivated more by the desire to reduce his sentence than by genuine attitude change. But prison psychologists noted some progress in his ability to understand different perspectives. The third attacker remained defiant and had been involved in several incidents with other prisoners and staff. He had been transferred to a higher security facility and was considered unlikely to be released before serving his full sentence. Prison officials were concerned about his potential to influence other inmates and had placed restrictions on his communications and associations. The broader Manchester community had maintained the spirit of solidarity that had emerged following the attack and been reinforced by the royal visit. Interfaith cooperation had become institutionalized through formal partnerships between religious organizations, shared programming in schools, and coordinated community service projects. The City Council had established an annual Manchester Unity Award to recognize individuals and organizations that promoted interfaith understanding and combated hatred. The first recipients included the mosque members who had helped guard David Goldstein's home, the Christian volunteers who had assisted with synagogue restoration, and the Sikh community leaders who had organized solidarity events. Local schools had developed curriculum materials that used the synagogue attack and its aftermath as a case study in citizenship education. Students learned about religious freedom, community responsibility, and peaceful conflict resolution through examining both the crime and the response it generated. These materials have been shared with educational systems in other cities facing similar challenges. The media coverage of the royal visit had generated ongoing interest in Manchester's approach to interfaith relations. Delegations from other cities had visited to study their methods and to discuss adaptation of successful programs to different contexts. Manchester had become a model for how diverse communities could work together to resist extremism while celebrating their differences. Economic indicators suggested that the positive attention had also benefited the city's reputation as a destination for business investment and tourism. The response to the synagogue attack had demonstrated social stability and community cohesion that made Manchester attractive to organizations seeking locations for expansion or relocation. As the first anniversary of the attack approached, community leaders began planning commemoration events that would honor the victims while celebrating the progress that had been made. The anniversary would mark not just the passage of time, but the transformation of trauma into purpose and of individual suffering into collective strength. Rabbi Stern reflected on the journey her community had traveled during those 12 months. The attack had been intended to fragment and intimidate, but it had ultimately strengthened bonds within the Jewish community and built new relationships with neighbors from different backgrounds. The royal visit had provided official recognition of their experience, But the real validation had come from the thousands of ordinary citizens who had chosen to stand with them. The path forward remained challenging, with ongoing security concerns and the persistent threat of extremist ideology. However, the community had demonstrated that hatred could be countered by love, that isolation could be overcome by solidarity, and that trauma could be transformed into wisdom. The conversation that had begun with a criminal act had evolved into a broader dialogue about building inclusive societies capable of protecting all citizens while preserving the democratic freedoms that made diversity possible. The king's visit had marked an important milestone in that conversation, but the ultimate success would be measured by the daily choices of ordinary people to choose understanding over prejudice and cooperation over conflict. The synagogue attack had tested Manchester's commitment to its values. The response had demonstrated that those values remained strong and that communities united by shared principles could overcome challenges that might otherwise divide them. The legacy of that terrible night would be found not in the memory of hatred, but in the ongoing work of building a society worthy of its highest aspirations.